Hey, welcome to Dice Over Everything. This is Take a Billion.
Yep.
This is Alan.
This is Brandon.
And today we want to talk about the miniatures gaming hobby and why everyone calls it a hobby and not something else.
Yeah, lots of things get called hobbies, but I mean, miniatures is kind of a game, but also you get to call it a hobby to...
And it's almost, you can't even classify it. You're not summing up miniatures gaming if you call it a game. You have to add the hobby because it's not just gaming, at least for a large portion of the people that play it.
No, like when people think of games, they'll think of like playing ping pong, they'll think of playing board games, they'll think of playing like card games.
Or like first-person shooters.
Yep, but they don't think of painting and building toy soldiers.
Yes, and that is so, in my opinion, so critical to the hobby and what makes it great and different.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the hobby part maybe has something to do with like how much you're expressing yourself or how much sort of your ideas are part of the game you're playing as opposed to...
Yeah, and I think it's not just expressing yourself, it doesn't even have to be expressing yourself. Mm-hmm. It's the entire idea of building something, creating something.
So you could go and want to play like the Blood Angels and you get the codex and you look at the pictures and you paint them like Blood Angels and it's still a hobby because you've gone...
Exactly, and you're assembling things that other people have come up with and you're just putting it together, but it's that idea of creation that makes this thing so much more different than even the board gaming hobby, which we were just talking about how Brandon doesn't consider board gaming a hobby, but obviously a lot of serious board gamers consider it a hobby.
Yep. So I guess there's an entire other topic about what's art at some point and then what's doing a hobby, because I guess the art aspect is you come up with the whole thing from scratch, whereas it being a hobby is you're kind of working within the framework if they're already being sort of the models there, the pre-done way of doing things, and you're kind of following in the set path that's already there for you. But that's a whole other topic of when you've gone into the art world, and we're definitely not... I wouldn't say I'm in the art world.
You're not an artiste?
No.
Not yet. Wait until you can sell some of your things. Actually, if you create your entire miniatures line yourself and then paint it yourself, you're an artist.
Yep, I would not question that.
So the hobby thing is like... Yeah, I guess there's some consumption in that. You're taking someone else's stuff and you're still creating something, although you're paying money usually for the privilege of being able to create something. But the enjoyment you get out of it partially is putting something together, right?
Yeah, so I guess why I would say like maybe the board games aren't totally hobbyish, because if you're taking the minis hobby, you're building your army beforehand, like you're making a list beforehand of what you think's going to be good in the game. You're going beforehand, painting and assembling this whole thing, whereas in a board game, you show up, things are already preset for you. You haven't done anything. Yep. Like, I mean, there's a creative aspect to what you're doing in the game right there and then, but to enter into the game, you haven't done like the whole work behind it of the hobby aspect. So that's why I would say it's more just a game.
You could say it's more game-like and less hobby-like than real hobbies like miniature gaming.
Which is why I guess you've got X-Wing out there, and I don't think they sell it as a miniatures game. I think...
No, they do. It's called X-Wing Miniatures Game.
Okay. But
you don't have your finger on the pulse of the miniatures gaming / board gaming hobby.
No, I don't. Because I just sit in my basement painting all day.
Which is what makes the thing so great. So I guess we talked a lot about just hobbies and classifications in general. But what we really want to talk about is what makes miniatures gaming the hobby part, why we like it so much more than all of these other things that technically you could say are hobbies, and there are things you can, like, as in hobbies, as in something you do on your free time for fun, right?
Yep.
But why the miniatures gaming hobby is so special and so dear to our hearts, and has like in some ways taken over our lives.
Well, I guess the fact that you get to create the game yourself, you can do it with other people, so you get to get out of the basement, so you get to like play a game with other people, but you're not playing somebody else's game, and it's not so repetitive, because if you play a board game, it's the same thing over and over. You go play ping pong, the ball just keeps going back and forth. I mean, you can get better at it, but it's not your game, and it's not like...
But in the same ways, when you look at most miniatures games, in terms of the rules, you're using someone else's rules, right? And in some ways, I think that's more talking about the expansion of the kind of games that we play, is that we generally don't get, well, a lot of the miniatures games, they continually expand, so you can feel like you're constantly experiencing something new and different. But I think that's actually part of the gaming aspect.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of other games have that kind of feeling, right? Like you look at
like video games and that, where they'll come up with
exactly.
they'll come
New
up with a Madden
expansion, like
2042 or whatever they come up with.
yes, exactly. With
And you're doing something new.
what I assume is the new sports players. Is that what you call them?
Sure.
The guys that throw balls and kick them and stuff?
Yes, the sports ball.
I don't even remember. You can call them players, right?
Sure.
I don't even remember what you call them. Oh my god.
They're hired thugs for your city. What?
I would call them mercenaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, so you have that or something, even like Magic the Gathering.
Where you create the deck, but you're not really creating the cards themselves.
Yeah, so it's expanding. It's just expanding out there, right? And that's just keeps it fresh. And you can have the same thing with board games.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the big things with the hobby aspect that you can't get from these other games is literally the assembling of the miniatures and painting them and seeing those put on the table. And especially when you start playing miniatures games where you even do the board, like you build terrain and you do all this kind of stuff.
So you've created a whole world as opposed to...
Exactly. And so it's almost not even the rules that you're using. It's actually the things that you're looking at, right? The toy soldiers that you just assembled and painted, right? That it's the look, it's the veneer over everything that makes it more creative, makes it feel more like a hobby, right? And just seeing the stuff that you've created put on the table is great. Like if you look at the other side, you can do the miniatures hobby, right? As opposed to the miniatures gaming hobby. You can literally assemble miniatures and paint them,
and they never compete against each other.
They never compete against each other, and that is one aspect, right? That's one hobby, right? Yep. That's definitely a hobby, right? But what makes a miniatures gaming hobby different than that? It's that you get to, instead of being a solitary hobby like you're talking about, right? You get to get together with your buddies, and put all of the things, like it's almost like a show and tell for adults, where you don't feel stupid just for doing show and tell. Although don't you go do like a show and tell for adults for the miniatures hobby?
Yeah, and they usually aren't competing. Well, the miniatures aren't battling each other. They're just, it's all about the expression. So it's more like every other hobby. It's not a gaming hobby anymore.
It's like if you're building woodworking or something like that, right? Where you show up and you show off your latest. These are totally things I'm talking out of my ass, because I have no idea what you do if you go to a group. No, you must just like show up with whatever you're woodworking. Do they make chairs? Is that woodworking?
Sure, unless you work in a factory.
I always
in which case,
well, okay, so I always thought woodworking would be cool because you get to make your chair and your table. And I always had this idea of having like a super expensive table with really, really nice wood. And then I realized that would take years and years of experience to create a good one. So now I'm just resigned to buying a nice one from someone who's actually good at it. But that,
or it came from a factory and they just told you it did. Just like just like X-Wing. Maybe they were painted by little people somewhere, or it was from a factory.
I honestly don't want one that's created from a factory, unless the factory cuts down like a redwood and it just has a big block of really nice wood. Okay, so maybe if it was super nice, but I would feel a little bit worse if it wasn't handcrafted by a bunch of people that are older than 12.
Well, you can't afford that, so that's unfortunate.
Yet,
we'll just keep going to IKEA.
You know what? I don't need a car. I can buy a new super nice table. That's actually my plan.
Okay, but then you do need a car for the miniatures.
No, I would get a rent-a-car, I guess. Or I could just bring people over to play at my place with my super nice table.
Well, you do create super nice miniatures tables, so I guess that's in the same realm. Anyhow, do we have more to say about the hobby part, or is that as far as we're going with it?
Oh no!
Now we can't even stop the recording.
Or maybe we did stop the recording.
We've been locked out.
Yeah, I don't understand. Okay, anyways, sorry. Say that again? I was distracted for a second.
Distracted by the super nice table you created for your miniatures, or the super nice table you want to create as a woodworking hobby?
No, I was distracted by the fact my computer turned off. But, alright, so... Should we just leave it?
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm going to cut this big chunk out.
Well, it needs an outro of some sort.
We're less than 10 minutes in. I don't think we're done talking about hobbies. I am not done. Like, if we were sitting there with Felix, right? Some guy who is not into creative endeavors since he turned 20. How would we sell him? We wouldn't be just like, oh, that's enough. Like, we want to sell this guy. So, Felix is here.
So if you want to sell someone who's not into creating things on what they can do.
Well, what makes this hobby so different from, like, let's say, playing video games? Like, we have a lot of friends who their time spent is, like, let's say, playing video games, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then sometimes you feel like you want to create something. It just feels good to, assemble those things and feel like, at the end, having accomplished something.
You're actually making something, so there's more sense of accomplishment than saying...
Exactly.
Than, say, playing a board game where you've just...
Like, the experience is great, and one of the things that makes board games better than, a lot of other kind of games or TV is that you're generally do it with someone.
There's an interaction there that you're not getting.
You actually are creating something. You're creating a relationship with whoever you're playing, and so it doesn't feel as much of a waste of time. And of course, it's fun at the time as well, right?
So I guess
assuming you're playing a good one.
I guess you could compare that to the sitting there watching TV or the video games. The video games is a step up definitely from watching TV, because now there's some level of interaction. There's now you actually have an input into it. I mean, sure, you're following like the predetermined path often the video game has, like there's an optimum thing to do in the video game, but then if you want even more interaction like than the video game, like sure you can like voice chat with people on the video game, but
it's just not as much when they're not sitting across the table. That's why it's so fun to just sit around and drink, because all you're doing is interacting with the people, and generally you're talking and doing nothing. But it's so enjoyable. So, but when you play a video game, because you've interceded the computer in between the two people, even if you're voice chatting, there's a separation. The interaction is not as rich. Even when it's kind of rich, it's not. It's often not as rich. Let's say. That's actually kind of why I stopped playing most of my video games. I felt like you can get all of those interactions better in a lot of different kind of ways, right? So for me, at first it was board games, right?
So it means getting away from the computer at one point, because if you've got people who have like office jobs and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, that was definitely a thing.
That going home and playing video games after sitting at the desk, like on the computer, and going home and sitting at the computer, or if you're in school and you've got to do like work on the computer.
That was definitely a thing.
Yep. If you want to move away from that, because that obviously, like, some people it's okay for, but I would say for most people that's not good with.
Yeah. So then what I ended up getting left with was, what can a computer game give me that other things can't give me better, right? And it was single player games, right? Something I can do on my own when I have my own free time and stuff like that. But at the same time, I was like, well, why would I even want that time? Right? So why would I want that off time? And it's only basically if I have nothing else I can do, I'll fit in a video game. But literally, if I have one person to hang out with, it's generally more fun. It's generally
better than playing the video game the same level.
Exactly. Just
for
even
the 50th time.
Exactly. For most video games, right? And that's why the only video games that I'm really actually I kind of like now are the ones that you can sit next to each other on a couch and talk for like half the time, right? It has to be really richly interactive. That's why I felt like when I saw the Wii come out, I was like, oh, that's kind of lame. But when you actually play the Wii and the kind of games that they create for it, they're like social party games. Almost.
They're not meant to be played competitively online. They're meant just to be played with other people.
Yeah.
And, well, basically meant to be interactive because you're next to each other.
Yeah. So, although when I think about the board games that I play, they're not. A lot of them are super thinky or whatever. And maybe it's the illusion of actually interacting with a person through the board game, which you still get when you play a board game. Because they're actually literally sitting across from you.
You can if you want to.
Yeah. And you're telling the person the move, right, that you're going to do, even though I guess that's good enough.
It could be. So I guess if you're moving on to like a hobby thing, like board games, you show up, you play, whereas hobby, you kind of need like free time to be in a little more
to work and,
to be
and creative.
You need like a little bit of excess of free time to be able to like express your creativity.
That's the thing for the single player versus the single player video games versus the hobby aspect of painting and stuff, right? Is you can get a lot of that. Well, you can fill time basically when you're alone doing like with nothing else to do with painting miniatures or assembling miniatures, right? That's something you can do on solitary when you get home and do whatever, right? And once you get to a certain, like when you start out, it can seem a little bit complex, but once you've got a little bit of skill, it's actually kind of relaxing.
It becomes more relaxing because you fall into the groove of doing it.
Exactly. And and here's the rub for me that kind of solidified that kind of hobby is another thing that often people will do is watch TV, right? Or watch a movie or something like that. I now watch or listen to something while I'm assembling or painting, right?
Yep.
And my solitary thing. So I literally get to do both, right? And of course you're not paying as much attention when you're assembling, right? But even if you only like to, even if you get 70% of the enjoyment out of watching something, concentrating on it 100%, you get this whole extra happiness of assembling the model or painting a model, right?
And being able to listen to something entertaining or watch something
so
entertaining.
You're almost doubling up. So you only get like, so let's say you get 30% less enjoyment out of the thing you listen to or watch.
You can't watch the best
well,
movies.
You don't watch them because you can't see that. You gotta look at what you're doing, right? So you get 30% less enjoyment, or even 50%. But you gain this entire enjoyment of assembling and painting. So you're like at 120 or 130% already, even if like the assembling model hobbying thing is only just as fun or even less fun, you find, by itself than watching or listening to something. That's my mathematical reason of happiness.
Formula for maximizing
happiness. Exactly. So yeah, I decided, what's the point of just watching TV and stuff? And I hardly watch any movies now when I'm by myself or watching TV, right? When I have nothing else to do.
Unless you're feeling completely lazy, you don't go to that end of complete non-interaction.
Yep.
So I guess I would say most people want some sort of like outlet for their creativity. Maybe it's like playing music. Maybe it's like doing just pure art.
Yeah.
Or things like that.
Yep.
So often I guess a lot of people don't have that though because they just run around on the hamster wheel all day. But some people have the time to do it and they just and they know they're wasting it watching TV or playing video games or whatever, and you're like,
you can watch TV and do the creativity with this kind of hobby.
Yes, you don't even tell them they're being stolen away from their TV programs. You can do this as well.
Yep, exactly.
That's one way of saying
it. And a lot of TV, especially nowadays, is just you just listen to it. Like the visuals are not necessarily as important. Although sometimes I do miss seeing the visuals of TV kind of take me in. But then I just go watch a movie because right? It's not like I can't watch movies anymore.
So. You can't watch action movies while it's going on. I can tell you that.
Exactly. So I do every once in a while watch it, but I've cut down a lot of how much I actually watch things.
And that's why I don't watch things because I only watch action movies, and I can't paint.
What do you listen to?
Just podcasts, music.
Podcasts, yeah, music.
If you get bored,
you can actually really enjoy music while doing it. If you're really into music, which a large segment of the population is, you can go and turn that on and do it.
You have an excuse to listen to just 2 hours of music at once, whereas you would never normally do that.
Yeah, like when you're doing your dishes, you can't listen to music because their dishes are too loud. Yeah,
and hopefully you don't have to do dishes for 2 hours.
Although, I do have noise canceling headphones, and it's amazing because I literally now I can't do dishes just by itself. I literally have to go find a good podcast and then put on my noise canceling headphones, do like 5 minutes of dishes, and then go paint.
Okay, well, I guess that need for stimulation
Yeah.
keeps going up if you keep getting it. So once you go to doing like the actual hobby of like minis, you're like, the board games are so mundane compared to what I
don't
can
think
do.
so, though.
Nope.
So we just talked about how it replaces the hobbying aspect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's by yourself, right? So if I were to compare that to playing board games, of course I'd want to also play board games because I want to engage with my friends, right? So that's what I mean by like those direct correlations of what we talked about. It's for the... So in some ways, I actually am agreeing with you because I'm pretty sure you're talking about this other thing I'm about to say.
Which is?
Well, why don't you say it and we'll see if I jumped the gun and said... And what were you going to say?
Oh, I think I'm thinking something totally else, so you have to keep going here.
All right. So, it's different from... Oh, my God. Hello? All right. So, it's different from just... So we talked about how you're by yourself, you're playing games, right? Oh, sorry.
Okay.
No, you're not by yourself. You're by yourself, you're painting your minis. It's great because, sometimes you don't have any time to do anything else, right? You can't get like 2 hours of a block, so you go and paint some minis or something like that, or assemble some guys,
Okay.
right? Comparing to that, obviously you still want to get together with your friends and play games, right? And that's what's great about board games.
And you can't play sports all the
there.
time either.
And you can't
And
play
not-
sport.
and not
Well, some
every-
people do,
Mhm.
right? But let's say you let's say you don't like sports,
Yep.
right? As much, like some people. Yeah. So then you go play board games. Well, there's also miniature games, which is technically you could say it's a type of board game, right? You're playing it on a board or whatever. But what makes, in my opinion, miniature board games so cool in the miniature board gaming hobby is that you take your miniatures from your miniature hobby, you put them on the table, and play a board game with it. So, like I said, like the formula before, I talked about maximizing your watching TV or listening TV time.
Okay.
And then if you add on the miniature hobby to your listening time, you've now gotten to 150%, like maximizing happiness.
So you've got your maximum sharing of your creativity combined with your maximum getting to interact with other people to play games.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
exactly my point. So you can go and play your board game. You get all the enjoyment of your board game because it's a board game, but you get to then put down your miniatures and look at them, right? And it's beautiful, and you get that sense of accomplishment when you look at them and when it's painted. And then you also, once you get a little bit, well, almost everyone, like once you put it down at the table, it looks sweet. So you get that visual feast for the eyes, right?
It does.
And oftentimes, if you get really good, now it looks better than any board game that you can buy on the market, right? Because they have to mass produce it, and so it's not going to be able to you're not going to have that tender, loving care that two guys that have been miniature hobbying for like 10 years have on their armies that they put on the table, or their pieces, you would say, from a board game.
So it's the coolest looking game. Plus,
Yep.
Plus, usually the games are way more in depth than board games. So
Yep.
you can think about it way more. Whereas with a board game, you sort of think about it to a certain point, then you kind of reach a conclusion, and then you don't really need to think about the board game much more.
I think that just depends on what board games you play.
Mm-hmm.
The maximum thinking in board games
Oh,
is
there's-
definitely higher.
there's 4-hour
than
board
miniature
games.
There's also
There's usually
like
less There's usually
super
less
thinky
randomness.
games. There's super thinky games in board games that definitely people obsess over the thinking aspect way more than any miniature gamer does.
But that's why miniature games usually have a randomness element to it to stop you from just going completely crazy into the overthinking it, so you can actually just sit back and enjoy it.
I don't know. That's too much to parse.
Okay.
I don't think you can say it one way or the other.
All right.
But I'm saying that, I think you could say that it encourages people not to overthink it because you're getting this entire experience, like by having that visual feast for the eyes when you have, like, let's say fully modeled terrain that everyone's taken time to make, put all these miniatures on top. the experience you get from that is just kind of makes it so you can't fully think about the game in some ways, right? And then also the fact that you've assembled these guys and they look awesome, and you kind of generally with miniatures games, there's the entire fluff aspect where you're creating a guy to be a character.
There's like
right?
a backstory to the whole army you've created.
Exactly. Even if you haven't thought about it fully, just the act of assembling him or her and painting painting it makes you...
And how you choose to paint it.
Exactly. You add some sort of feelings for that thing.
That even if you paint them in their standard color scheme, you've now given them the feeling of all the background fluff that they've written up, which is often really kind of cool.
Yeah.
Or you can go paint them differently, and
but even if they don't have background fluff, just the assemblage, it's like a painting, right? Just looking at a painting with everything that you see them right with, that adds some character to it.
That
right?
even somebody else looking at it would sort of create a story in their head for who they are.
Exactly, right? And so all of that kind of lends itself to a more experiential consumption of the game, whereas the most thinky games literally are like Go and chess, where they almost intentionally remove the relation to real life or experiences so that you can concentrate on just the game aspects. Even though I guess chess and Go were supposed to be simulations of some type of thing.
Yeah, if you mathematically can
it's a simulation of math graphs, right? With Go, and you're like, okay, so I don't know, yeah.
So, is there a lot more we want to talk about for what makes it a hobby versus a game? Or have we sort of covered that already?
I think we covered that in the beginning, and then we talked about why I believe that miniature gaming is the
superior form of hobby and superior form of game.
Hobby for maximizing your happiness.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we can convince lots of people about that, or you could go out there with what we've talked about and try and convince other people about it, but maybe don't use the math part. Maybe just let them.
I think the math part is really, really useful. A lot of the guys that are into this thing are super into math.
It helps when you're doing numbers and dice. So maybe it is the right audience to sell it that way. So on that note, I think we've
gone as long as we want to.
Yes, we have.
And maybe a little bit further. But yeah, so that is our talk about hobbying, and I'm sure we'll revisit this again another time.
Oh yes.
Yeah, especially since we had we before this talk, we actually created a graph and talked about experience versus
creativity versus
consumption versus creation and competition. So we didn't even talk about competition.
Nope. So that can be a future topic. So till next time.
All right, this is Alan.
This is Brandon.
And this has been Dice Over Everything.